The rain poured down mercilessly on the empty streets of downtown as a man in his mid-40s stumbled past the darkened shop windows. His expensive suit, now torn and soaked, clung to his body as he pressed his hand against the wound in his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, mixing with the rainwater that ran down his face. Just 12 hours ago, Richard Wong sat in his penthouse office on top of the world. He had built his tech company from nothing, turning a small startup into a billion-dollar empire. The view from his office showed the city he loved, the city where he'd made his fortune. But that view had been the last peaceful moment of his day. It started with an email. A strange message from the company's accounting system that shouldn't have existed. Richard wasn't supposed to see it, but a glitch in the system had sent it straight to his inbox. As he dug deeper, his hands began to shake. The numbers didn't add up. Hundreds of millions of dollars had vanished, hidden behind fake accounts and shell companies. The betrayal cut deep. The people behind it weren't strangers, they were his trusted advisors. People he had dinner with, whose children's graduations he'd attended. For 3 years, they had been stealing from the company, from the shareholders, from him. When he confronted them in the boardroom, he expected denial. Instead, he saw something cold in their eyes. "You should have left it alone," his CFO had said, his voice eerily calm. That's when Richard realized they had too much to lose. They couldn't let him expose the truth. The next few hours became a blur of violence and fear. They had hired professionals. Richard managed to escape the initial attack, but not before a knife found its way between his ribs. He ran through service corridors and back alleys, his phone dead, his wallet gone. The rain had started, washing away any trail of blood he left behind, both a blessing and a curse. Now, as midnight approached, the city felt different. The towering buildings that once represented his success now loomed over him like prison walls. The streets he used to drive through in his luxury car became a maze of shadows where any dark corner could hide his attackers. His vision started to blur. The loss of blood was taking its toll. The same determination that had built his empire now focused on a single goal: survival. One foot in front of the other. Keep moving. Find help. But each step became heavier than the last. Richard's thoughts drifted to his life's work crumbling around him, to all the employees who depended on him, to the truth that needed to come out. He hadn't fought his way up from nothing just to die in the rain. Yet his body was failing him. The sidewalk rushed up to meet him as his legs finally gave out. As consciousness slipped away, the bitter irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent years building walls around himself, surrounding himself with luxury and security. Now, bleeding out on the cold concrete, he was just another vulnerable human being. All his wealth, all his power, meant nothing in this moment. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was a figure approaching through the rain. Friend or foe? It didn't matter anymore. He had no strength left to run. As his eyes closed, a strange peace washed over him. Sometimes, he would later realize, you have to lose everything to find what really matters. Little did he know, this moment, his lowest point, would become the beginning of a story far more meaningful than all his billions could have bought. But first, he had to survive the night. The sound of rain hitting cardboard woke Linda Chen from her light sleep. Living on the streets had taught her to stay alert, survival depended on it. Through the drizzle, she could make out the familiar shapes of the alley she called home, the stack of wooden pallets that sheltered her from the wind, the old tarp that kept her belongings dry, and the scattered belongings of other homeless folks who shared this forgotten corner of the city. 10 years in the military had given her the skills to survive almost anywhere. But after 3 tours of duty and a leg injury that still bothered her on cold nights, she never imagined she'd be using those skills on the streets of her own country. Still, she had built a life here of sorts. The other homeless veterans in the area looked up to her, and she did what she could to keep everyone safe. That's why she noticed the strange shape on the sidewalk immediately. At first, she thought it was just another pile of garbage, but something about it made her look twice. Through the rain, she saw an arm move slightly. Her military training kicked in instantly. Approaching cautiously, she'd seen enough trouble on these streets to be careful. She found a man lying face down in a growing puddle. His expensive clothes were soaked through with rain and something darker. Blood. Her hands moved automatically, checking for a pulse while her eyes scanned the street for any danger. "Hey, can you hear me?" She turned him gently, years of combat medical training guiding her movements. The man's face was pale, his breathing shallow. The wound in his side wasn't deep enough to be immediately fatal, but in these conditions, infection would kill him just as surely. Linda knew she had two choices: call an ambulance and watch another person disappear into a system that often failed people like her, or handle this herself. The decision took less than a second. "Hang in there," she whispered, more to herself than to him. With strength that surprised even her, she managed to half-carry, half-drag him to her shelter. The rain had soaked through her own clothes now, but she barely noticed. Her mind was already running through what she needed: antibiotics, clean bandages, somewhere warm and dry. There was only one person who might help without asking questions. Dr. Park ran a small clinic 6 blocks away. He had a soft spot for veterans, having served himself and sometimes helped Linda's homeless community off the books. But even his kindness had limits. Supplies weren't free. Linda's hand went to her neck, where a silver pendant hung on a worn leather cord. Her last possession of any value, it was all she had left of her mother. She had promised herself she would never sell it, but promises meant little when someone's life hung in the balance. Working quickly, she cleaned and bandaged the wound as best she could with her limited supplies. The man mumbled something in his fever, his expensive watch glinting in the dim light. Linda almost laughed at the irony. That watch probably cost more than she had seen in the past year, but right now it couldn't help him. Dr. Park was reluctant at first, even for her. But when Linda placed her mother's pendant on his desk, his expression softened. He provided antibiotics, proper bandages, and even came to check on the mysterious patient himself. "You're either crazy or an angel," he told her, shaking his head as he left. As dawn broke over the city, Linda sat watching her unexpected guests breathing steady. She didn't know his story, how a man in a suit worth thousands had ended up bleeding on the street. But she knew what it meant to fall from grace, to lose everything. Sometimes, she reflected, the universe had a strange way of bringing people together. Her mother's pendant was gone, but as she watched color return to the man's face, she felt a different kind of warmth. Some things were worth more than silver and memories. Besides, she had learned long ago that helping others was its own kind of wealth, the kind that couldn't be stolen or lost. Morning light filtered through the cracks in the makeshift shelter, waking Richard from a fever-filled sleep. His first instinct was to reach for his phone, but his pockets were empty. The events of the previous night came rushing back as pain shot through his side. He found himself lying on a clean but worn sleeping bag, his wound carefully bandaged. "You're finally awake." A woman's voice, calm and steady, came from nearby. "How's the pain on a scale of 1 to 10? Richard turned his head to see his rescuer, a woman perhaps in her late 30s, with tired but kind eyes and the straight-backed posture that screamed military training. She sat on an overturned milk crate, stirring something in a dented pot over a small camping stove. 8, he admitted, trying to sit up. The woman moved quickly to help him, her movements efficient and practiced. Thank you for helping me." "Thank the doc who provided the antibiotics," she replied, pouring something steamy into a chipped mug. "Drink this. It's just tea, but you need fluids." She didn't mention the pendant she'd traded for his care. Something about her told him she never would. Over the next few days, Richard learned more about the hidden world he'd stumbled into. His rescuer, who simply went by Chen, had created a small community among the homeless in this area. People looked out for each other, shared what little they had. A teenager named Mike brought them day-old bread from the bakery where he washed dishes. An elderly man called Doc, not a real doctor, but he knew enough to help with basic medical needs, checked on people, and kept spirits up with terrible jokes. Richard kept his own identity hidden, giving only his first name. He knew his face might have been on the news by now, his company's stock had to be in freefall. But nobody here had smartphones or watched stock reports. Their concerns were more immediate: food, shelter, safety. Chen taught him their unwritten rules: which places were safe to sleep, which should be avoided, how to tell if someone was truly dangerous or just struggling, where to find food, clean water, basic necessities. "Everyone has a story," she told him one evening as they shared a meal with others. "Nobody ends up here because things went right." He watched her organize their small community with the same skill he'd once used to run his company. When a new person arrived, scared and hungry, Chen knew exactly what they needed, sometimes just food, sometimes a sympathetic ear, sometimes both. She treated everyone with the same dignity, whether they were former business owners or people battling addiction. The wound in his side healed slowly, but something else was happening too. For the first time in years, Richard saw the world without the filter of wealth and power. He noticed how the coffee shop owner who'd once served him premium roasts would chase away homeless people just trying to get warm. He saw how people crossed the street to avoid the very community that had saved his life. One night, unable to sleep, he heard Chen talking to a young woman who'd just lost her job and apartment. "Rock bottom has a purpose," Chen told her softly. "It shows you what you're made of and, more importantly, who's willing to catch you when you fall." The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years building walls around himself, trusting people who'd tried to kill him, while distrusting those who had nothing to gain. Now, among people who owned nothing, he found more humanity than in all his board meetings combined. His strength returned gradually, but he hesitated to leave. Not just because his attackers might still be looking for him, but because he was learning something vital. His rescuer and her community had next to nothing, yet they'd created something his billions never could, a place where people truly cared for each other. As he helped Chen organize supplies one morning, a newspaper blew down the alley. His own face stared back at him from the front page. "Tech billionaire still missing, company in chaos." Chen picked it up before he could stop her. Their eyes met over the headline. He waited for her expression to change, for the same greed he'd seen in so many others once they discovered his wealth. Instead, she simply handed him the paper with a slight smile. "Well," she said, returning to sorting donated clothes, "that explains the watch. Good thing we're too busy here to read the news." In that moment, he realized she'd probably known for days. It just didn't matter to her. In this hidden corner of the city, he wasn't a billionaire or a CEO. He was just another human being who needed help. After the newspaper revelation, Richard and Chen sat in their makeshift shelter, sharing a pot of instant coffee as he finally told her everything. The fraud, the betrayal, the attack, it all spilled out in the dim light of a battery-powered lantern. Chen listened without interrupting, her expressions shifting between concern and tactical assessment. "Your CFO, the quiet one with the perfect record," she said when he finished. "He started acting differently about 3 months ago." Her military training had taught her to spot patterns, and something about this detail caught her attention. "Yes," Richard leaned forward, wincing slightly at his healing wound. "He changed his schedule, started taking calls outside the office. I thought he was dealing with personal issues." Chen pulled out a worn notebook. 3 months ago, a guy in an expensive suit started visiting the homeless camp near the port. Asking questions about places to move large amounts of money without attention, she flipped through pages of careful observations. "My friend who works at the docks, he noticed unusual shipments around the same time." Richard's mind raced. The port. Of course. His company had invested heavily in shipping technology. The perfect cover for moving stolen money. "How do you know all this?" Chen gave a small smile. "People think we're invisible. They talk freely around us, ignore us in plain sight. You'd be amazed what you learn when nobody thinks you're paying attention." Over the next few days, they pieced together the puzzle using Chen's network of unlikely spies, the homeless veteran who cleaned offices at night, the teenager who delivered lunches to corporate buildings, the old man who sold newspapers on the corner. Each had seen fragments of the larger picture. "Your board members didn't just steal money," Chen explained one evening, laying out their findings. "They're using your shipping technology to help other companies hide illegal profits. The money they stole from you was just their entry fee into a bigger game." Richard felt sick. "My entire company, everything I built, is still yours," Chen interrupted firmly. "But you need proof. Real proof, not just street observations." That's when Chen introduced him to Li, a former EAT specialist who lived in an abandoned warehouse. Before addiction had taken everything from him, he'd worked in corporate security. His hands shook as he typed on a borrowed laptop, but his skills were still sharp. "Your CFO made a mistake," Li said, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "He used the same password pattern for his private accounts. Give me 2 days." While they waited, Chen taught Richard to move through the city unnoticed. How to change his walk, alter his appearance just enough to blend in. The best disguise, she explained, is to look like someone people want to ignore. They worked out of an abandoned office after hours, using the building's Wi-Fi through a window. Chen's military strategy combined with Li's tech skills helped them map the entire operation. The corrupt executives had created a shadow network using Richard's legitimate business as cover, but they'd grown careless, thinking no one was watching. "Look at this," Li pointed to his screen one night, his hands steadier now that he had a purpose. They moving the money through a series of shell companies, but they all connect back to a trust. A trust in your family's name. Richard stared at the documents in shock. The betrayal went deeper than he'd imagined. His own cousin, a trustee he'd appointed years ago, was part of the conspiracy. The same cousin who had suggested hiring the CFO in the first place. "Family," Chen said softly, recognition in her eyes. "Sometimes the deepest wounds come from those closest to us." As they compiled evidence, Richard watched Chen work. She coordinated their makeshift team with the same skill she used to organize the homeless community. Every person had a role, a purpose. The elderly woman who'd once been a legal secretary helped organize documents. The teenager who knew every alley in the city acted as their messenger. One night, as they worked late, Chen finally asked the question he'd been dreading. "When this is over, when you get your life back, what then?" Richard looked around at their unlikely team, people society had written off who were now helping to expose a massive corporate conspiracy. "Everything's different now," he said quietly. "I'm different. When I get my company back, things are going to change." Chen nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Rock bottom shows you what matters. Just don't forget what you learned down here." As they gathered the final pieces of evidence, Richard realized something profound. His attackers had meant to destroy him by taking everything away. Instead, they'd given him something invaluable, a chance to see the world through different eyes, to understand what real wealth looked like. It wasn't in his bank accounts or stock options, but in the community that had formed around him, in the people who helped him simply because it was right. The truth was ready to come out. But Richard knew that exposing the conspiracy wouldn't be the end of the story, it would be the beginning of something much more important. The morning they decided to act started like any other in the homeless community. Chen was helping distribute donated coffee when Richard approached with their worn folder of evidence. Their eyes met, and a silent understanding passed between them. It was time. "Your company's having an emergency board meeting tomorrow," said Li, their tech expert, looking up from his laptop. The tremor in his hands had almost disappeared now that he'd found purpose in helping them. "They're planning to vote on selling off major assets, probably their final move to hide the money." Richard nodded, his expression grim. "Then we move today." He turned to Chen. "Are you sure you want to be part of this? It could get messy." Chen's laugh was soft but determined. "I've handled worse in 3 tours of duty. Besides," she gestured to their gathered allies, "we're all in this together now." Their plan was simple but clever, born from Chen's military strategy and their community's street smarts. The old newspaper seller, who'd been watching the company's front entrance for weeks, confirmed the security shift changes. The teenager who delivered lunches knew every service entrance and blind spot in the building. "Remember," Chen told Richard as they prepared, "you're not just fighting for your company anymore. You're fighting for everyone who's been pushed aside, forgotten, treated like they don't matter." They set their plan in motion at midday. The cleaning lady, a grandmother who'd been homeless until Chen helped her find work, let them in through a service entrance. Richard felt strange walking through his own building like an intruder, but Chen's training had taught him well. They moved invisibly, just 2 more people nobody wanted to notice. In the executive floor's bathroom, Richard changed into a suit they'd carefully prepared. Minutes later, he walked into his old office like a ghost returning home. His secretary's shocked face turned to joy. She'd never believed the rumors of his death. "Call security," he told her calmly. "Have them seal all exits, then call an immediate board meeting. Full attendance, no excuses." Word spread through the building like wildfire. Richard Wong, the missing CEO, had returned. As board members rushed to the conference room, Chen coordinated their team through text messages. The former legal secretary positioned herself near the building's back exits. The dock worker watched the parking garage. No one would slip away this time. In the boardroom, Richard faced his betrayers. His CFO's face went pale, his cousin's hands trembled. But it was Chen's quiet entrance that caused the most stir. This clearly homeless woman walking confidently into the highest levels of corporate power. Before anyone calls security, Richard's voice cut through the chaos. You should know that everything you've done is documented here. He placed their folder on the table. Every transaction, every shell company, every illegal deal. Lee had done his work well. On the room screens, evidence began to appear. Bank transfers, falsified documents, secret meetings, all laid bare. The board members watched in horror as their scheme unraveled. You can't prove anything, Richard's cousin stood, desperate. It's your word against ours. That's when Chen stepped forward, placing a small device on the table. Actually, she said, her military bearing commanding attention, we have something better than paper trails. She pressed play, and the room filled with recorded conversations, the corrupt executives' own voices detailing their crimes. My friends on the street, Chen explained, the ones you walked past every day without a glance? They've been watching, listening, recording. It's amazing what people say when they think no one's paying attention. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements, FBI interviews, and news reporters. But Richard's focus stayed on Chen and their unusual team. The homeless veterans who'd helped gather intelligence received job offers from the company's new security department. Lee was hired to rebuild the IT security system. Even the teenage messenger had a scholarship waiting when he finished school. As the sun set, Richard and Chen stood at his office window, watching the city lights come on. I've been thinking, he said, about what real wealth means. About how to measure success. Chen smiled, understanding in her eyes. By how many lives you lift up, not how high you climb. Exactly. Richard turned from the window, spreading out architectural plans on his desk. That's why I want to start something new. A foundation focused on homeless veterans at first, but expanding to help anyone who needs a second chance. Real housing, job training, medical care. Helping people rebuild their lives, Chen nodded. But it has to be done right, with dignity, with purpose, not charity, opportunity. That's why I need you to run it, Richard said simply. You understand both worlds now. You can bridge the gap. Chen was quiet for a moment, looking out at the city, the same city she'd survived in, but with new possibilities. On one condition, she finally said, we start with the people who helped us, show everyone that second chances aren't just talk. As night fell over the city, they began planning a different kind of company, one that measured profit not in dollars, but in lives changed. The conspiracy had tried to destroy Richard by taking everything away. Instead, it had shown him what true wealth looked like, the wealth of human connection, of purpose, of using power to lift others up. The city glittered below them, full of both darkness and light, struggle and hope. Somewhere out there, people were sleeping rough tonight. But tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new chances to rebuild. Sometimes, they had learned, you had to lose everything to find what really mattered. The headlines spread across every news channel. Tech billionaire returns, exposes massive corporate fraud. But in a small, converted warehouse across town, Richard and Chen were focused on something more important than headlines. This will be the first center, Chen explained to a group of homeless veterans. The warehouse's ground floor had been transformed into a welcoming space with comfortable chairs, clean facilities, and most importantly, respect. It's not just shelter, it's a starting point. The building hummed with activity. Lee, now clean-shaven and wearing a staff badge, was setting up computer stations for job training. The grandmother who'd helped them sneak into the corporate office was organizing the clothing donation area, teaching others her system for keeping everything dignified and accessible. We're not running this like a typical charity, Chen told her team, her military bearing softened by genuine care. Everyone who comes through those doors has value, has something to contribute. Our job is to help them remember that. Richard watched from the doorway, remembering his own journey. 3 months had passed since the dramatic board meeting that had exposed the conspiracy. His former CFO and the other conspirators were facing criminal charges. His cousin had turned state's evidence, revealing an entire network of corporate corruption. But the real story was happening here, in this warehouse and 2 others like it across the city. The foundation's first project was already changing lives. They called it Project Phoenix, rising from the ashes, starting fresh. Got a new one called the Teenage Messenger, now working part-time while finishing school. A man stood hesitantly in the doorway, clutching a worn backpack. His eyes held that familiar mix of pride and desperation that Richard had come to recognize. Chen approached him with the same respect she'd show a visiting dignitary. Military, she asked quietly, spotting his bearing. Marines. 2 tours, he replied, shoulders straightening slightly. Welcome home, brother, Chen said simply, and the man's eyes welled up. Let's get you started. The center's approach was different from traditional shelters. Everyone who came in was asked what they could teach others. The former Marine, it turned out, had been a mechanic. Within a week, he was helping set up their vehicle repair training program. Richard's corporate experience merged with Chen's practical knowledge to create something unique. They offered not just job training, but mental health support, legal aid, and most importantly, a community. The people they helped became part of the solution, teaching and supporting others in turn. One afternoon, Richard found Chen staring at the wall of success stories, photos of people who'd come through their doors and rebuilt their lives. Having second thoughts about leaving the streets, he asked gently. She shook her head. Thinking about that silver pendant, never thought losing it would lead to all this. Richard touched the frame of one photo, the elderly veteran who'd helped gather intelligence during their investigation. He now ran the center's kitchen, teaching culinary skills to others. Sometimes the things we lose make room for something greater. The foundation's work caught attention. Other companies started calling, wanting to learn their model. Chen found herself speaking at corporate events, her simple wisdom cutting through bureaucratic nonsense. You want to help? Start by seeing people, really seeing them. Richard's company transformed too. They hired foundation graduates, created training programs, set new industry standards for corporate responsibility. The shipping technology that had been used for fraud now tracked medical supplies to underserved communities. One evening, as they finished a long day, a familiar face appeared at the center. Dr. Park, the clinic doctor who'd helped save Richard's life, stood examining their medical facilities. Not bad, he said gruffly. Could use another volunteer doctor, though. Chen smiled. We saved you an office. Later, sitting in what had once been his luxurious corporate office, Richard reviewed the foundation's progress. The numbers were impressive. Hundreds helped, lives rebuilt, communities transformed. But it was the stories that mattered most. The mother who'd gotten her kids back after finding stable work. The veteran who'd finally gotten treatment for PTSD. The teenager who'd earned a college scholarship. His phone buzzed with a message from Chen. Emergency at the center. Need you here. Richard grabbed his coat, hurrying to the warehouse. He found the main room full of people, but instead of an emergency, he saw a celebration. Their first graduate was opening his own business, and everyone had gathered to support him. As he watched Chen lead the celebration, Richard realized something profound. His billions had once seemed like the measure of his success. Now he measured it differently, in lives changed, in hope restored, in communities rebuilt. The conspiracy that tried to destroy him had given him an unexpected gift. The chance to see what real power could do when used to lift others up. As the celebration continued around him, Richard smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning. 1 year had passed since the night Richard collapsed on that rain-soaked street. Today, he stood in front of a crowd, but not in an expensive suit or behind a corporate podium. He wore simple clothes and spoke from the steps of their newest community center, the 4th one they'd opened this year. A year ago, I thought I'd lost everything, he told the gathered crowd of graduates, current residents, and supporters. I was wrong. I found something instead, something money can't buy. The center behind him had once been an abandoned school. Now its classrooms buzzed with activity, job training programs, counseling sessions, support groups, and most importantly, hope. People who'd once been invisible were becoming leaders, teachers, success stories. Chen sat in the front row, smiling at how far they'd come. That morning, she'd found something special in her office, a silver pendant, identical to the one she'd traded to save Richard's life. He'd spent months tracking down one just like it, but she hadn't put it on. Instead, it hung in a small display case in the center's entrance, next to a simple plaque. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find what matters. After the ceremony, they walked through the center together. In the computer lab, Lee was teaching coding to a group of veterans. His hands were steady now as he pointed at the screen, explaining how technology could open new doors. 3 of his former students already worked at major tech companies. "Remember when we used to hide from the rain under that bridge?" Lee called out as they passed. "Now I have an office with a view." The kitchen was filled with wonderful smells. Their first success story, the former marine mechanic had discovered a talent for cooking alongside his repair skills. He now ran both the culinary program and a food truck business, employing other center graduates. "Chief wants you to taste the new recipe," he called, waving them over. His food truck enterprise had grown into a small fleet, each one staffed by people rebuilding their lives. In the youth section, their teenage messenger, now a college student, was tutoring younger kids after his classes. "Going to graduate early," he announced proudly. "Already got 3 job offers." The medical clinic had grown too. Dr. Park now led a team of volunteer doctors and nurses, many of whom had once ignored the homeless they now treated with dignity. "Less emergency cases these days," he reported gruffly, hiding a smile. "People are taking better care of themselves when they have hope." Richard's corporate office had changed as well. The top floor now housed the Foundation's headquarters, where Chen ran operations with the same efficiency she'd once used to survive on the streets. The view was the same, but the perspective was entirely different. "Got the latest numbers," Chen said, pulling out a tablet. 87% success rate for our job placement program. 92% housing retention, but the real success stories can't be counted. She was right. The real success was in the community they'd built. People who graduated from their programs kept coming back, not because they needed help, but because they wanted to help others. The cycle of giving had taken on a life of its own. Richard's company had transformed too. Their technology now served a higher purpose, tracking resources for disaster relief, connecting communities in need with resources, making sure help reached those who needed it most. The stock price had actually gone up. Turns out doing good was good for business. As evening fell, they gathered for their weekly community dinner. The tables were full of people from all walks of life. Corporate executives sat next to former homeless veterans, sharing meals and stories. The barriers that had once seemed so solid had melted away. "Got room for one more?" A woman stood in the doorway, clutching a small bag, fear and hope fighting in her eyes. Chen was there immediately, welcoming her with the same respect she showed everyone. "There's always room," Chen said simply, leading her to a seat. "That's how it works here. We all help each other up." Later that night, Richard found Chen in her office, looking at an old photograph of her military unit. "Miss it sometimes?" he asked. She shook her head. "This is my unit now. Different kind of battle, same mission, leaving no one behind." Richard understood. His own battle had changed too. The fight wasn't about money or power anymore. It was about showing people their own worth, helping them find their strength, building bridges where others saw walls. As they walked through the quiet center one last time that night, they'd passed the silver pendant in its case. The evening light caught it just right, making it shine like a beacon. "You know what I learned?" Richard said softly. "True wealth isn't what you have. It's what you give away and somehow get back multiplied." Ken nodded, understanding perfectly. "And real power isn't about rising above others. It's about lifting them up with you," they finished together. Outside, the city lights twinkled, each one representing a story, a possibility, a future waiting to be rewritten. The night was clear, no rain this time. But somewhere out there, someone else was having their own darkest night. Tomorrow, they'd find their way here, to this place of new beginnings. And the cycle would continue, proof that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can lead to the best thing you'll ever do.